On February 17th of 1970, pregnant mother Colette and her two daughters, Kristen and Kimberly, aged 5 and 2 years, were found murdered, along with their husband, Jeffrey McDonald, who was found injured at the scene of the crime. Now, when he was found, he was taken into custody and taken to the hospital to be treated for his wounds. They weren't serious, but the killer did do a lot of damage. And he was asked about what happened, and his story was that he had decided to take a nap on the couch because their youngest had peed his side of the bed. And so suddenly he heard screams coming from his daughter's room when his wife went in to go check on her and put her to sleep. And when he went in, he saw a gruesome scene, his daughter and his children laying on the floor. They had been stabbed multiple times with an ice pick. And he said that at the scene of the crime, he noticed that there were 3 figures. One of them was a woman wearing a floppy white hat, and 2 men who seemed to be kind of like her henchmen. And she gave distinct orders, and her orders were kill the pigs. However, as it came into light later, it was discovered that Jeffrey McDonald was in fact the murderer. Once forensic information had been gathered on the scene of the crime scene, it was discovered that Jeffrey McDonald was in fact the killer. He was the one who killed all 3 of his family members, including his pregnant wife. But the importance of this story is that through forensic information and through forensic analysis, we are able to take this information, we're able to make these fingerprints, we're able to find the information that we need in order to make these convictions. And so that is my introduction. Welcome to the world of forensics as a whole. However, I'm focusing specifically on forensic pathology. This is my quote, a question that sometimes drives me hazy: am I or the others crazy? That's a quote by Albert Einstein, and I think that it suits the world particularly well in the fact that nobody truly has insanity, no one is truly sane, because each individual differs greatly from one to the next. For one person, what may be sane may be completely insane to the next, and therefore it's kind of hard to define the actual definition of sanity. And so, thus, would you know that you're crazy, or is everybody else crazy? My name is Allyson C, and I am 17 years old. I'm a senior at Frisco High School, and I'm part of a moving family. We've moved pretty much everywhere in the States for my father's job. He is a surgeon, and so we are almost constantly moving around from year to year. I have 2 sisters named Madison and Riley, and I have 1 brother named Braden. My sister, one of them at least, is a freshman at school currently. You might know her. She likes to play on lots of the sports teams. I enjoy creative writing, painting, drawing, space exploration particularly. I like to look through a telescope and map the stars. And I also really enjoy microbiology, which fits along almost perfectly with forensic pathology, which is my topic of study. So one thing you might want to know about forensic pathology is that people often get it mistaken with forensic anthropology and morticians, which they're not quite the same. Forensic anthropologists focus specifically on bone structures of a deceased individual, as opposed to forensic pathologists, which are often actually certified doctors. They perform autopsies, they write the certificates of death, they do court and testimony, and they're medical examiners. That's another name for them. But they focus specifically on the individual who has the presence of soft tissue still, like flesh. Whereas forensic anthropologists usually deal with skeletonized cases in which most of the soft flesh is completely deteriorated. Morticians are also a different type of individual. They deal with making sure that the individual is prepped and ready for their funeral. They embalm them and make sure that they look nice. Forensic anthropology, which is a subdivision of forensic pathology that I'm focusing on, it's not necessarily a subdivision, but it is the subdivision I'm focusing on that I want to go as a kind of like a co-career with forensic pathology. They, as I stated before, work on completely decomposed cases. They study the bones, they take inventories of what's there, they write the certificates of death, they determine the identification of the individual based on their features, and they can determine historical figures by their bones at times, such as, if you've ever seen the TV show Bones, she works at Smithsonian, which is a lot of the work that she did in the beginning was identifying individuals that had died in like World War I or World War II. And a lot of that can be done through just features on the bone. So my interview experiences were extremely fun. I first met with Miss Jennifer Walls, which was an aunt of a friend of mine, and she's a mortician or funeral director, and it was really interesting to go in and see everything that she was doing because she was extremely intelligent with what she did. She showed me a lot of the tools they use to embalm and how that's done, where it's done, what type of coffins they use, or how people react at funerals. It was just basically a funeral info session in which I got to learn everything I ever wanted to know about funerals, which was awesome. And then I met with Dr. Reed Quinton, who was the mentor of a former ISM student. You may or may not know him. And he is a medical examiner at the same place my mentor currently works. And he gave me a basic outline of forensic pathology, what I should expect from the career, schooling, internship, any basic information I wanted to know. And then he went ahead and referred me to two other forensic pathologists who gave me some very valuable information as well, and I got to meet with them on the exact same day. And I met with Dr. Tracy Dyer. She was also a medical examiner. She gave me a law background. Before she had become a forensic pathologist, she had specialized in law enforcement, and so she was very particular. She particularly knowledgeable about law and how it applies to forensic pathology, in the way that if you have a background in law, you're able to testify a little bit better at court and know what's going on and how to apply that in a way that may be helpful. Dr. Jill Urban, who is my current mentor, is also a medical examiner at the Stemmons Freeway Institute of Forensic Sciences, and she is a forensic anthropologist as well, which really struck my interest. She focuses on those skeletonized cases as well as the actual forensic pathology, and that's exactly what I was wanting to do, and so I thought it was kind of a miracle that I could find someone who was exactly what I wanted to be. And lastly, I met with Dr. Stephen Hastings. He's a pathology fellow, and he basically just told me what I need to know about the schooling portion, which was really great because he's closer to the schooling portion, and so he knows more. It's more fresh in his mind. He told me that the MCAT is probably the most important thing that you should ever have to study for medical school. College is really important. They're looking for well-rounded individuals who are willing to not just do school, but participate in other side activities as well, which is something I'm going to definitely look into. So my mentor is Dr. Jill Urban, and she graduated from Kansas State University with an anthropology or a Bachelor of Anthropology. She is a forensic pathologist and a forensic anthropologist, as mentioned before, which means that she does both skeletonized cases and soft tissue cases. She went to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, just to visit, which is also known as the body farm, which is where they basically take individuals who are deceased and donate their bodies to science and put them in different circumstances and situations so that they can see the different deterioration rates of, say, soft flesh, or if it rains on a body, they get to see how the body decomposes as compared to something else. She's married with 2 children. She enjoys running, surfing the internet, and making jewelry, which I thought was definitely interesting. My research experiences were Outlook assessment, which was giving me a basic intro to about how much college I would be expecting for becoming a forensic pathologist, which I think probably came around to about 11 to 18 years, just depending on how much I plan on taking on or how much extra I want to do. Suicide versus homicide was my second research assessment, which was very interesting to look into. It pertained a lot of information about the differences between a suicide case and a homicide case and how you can almost instantaneously tell the difference between the two depending on when they come in, how they look, how they have their gun positioned when they say shoot themselves. It's very important to know the difference between a homicide and a suicide, and the angle is very important in being able to determine that. I also researched photography pitfalls, which is a really big one and was very important to me because I had to take my own forensic photos this year. And it was important that I needed to be able to take the photographs without messing them up, if you will, and getting things in the way. A lot of the big photography pitfalls that were noted when I was doing the research assessment was that people often get in the way of the photographs. Say there's a foot on the ground where they're trying to take a picture of a clavicle, or there's someone passing by in the background, and you just have to be sure to get a picture that's completely and utterly focused on the bones or body limbs. I also researched the atherosclerotic, can't quite say it, CD, which is a disorder that affects individuals instantaneously and takes their life without really any warning. There's no way that they've really been able to figure out. There's a couple causes that kind of correlate, but it's mostly a mystery disorder. They haven't been able to find a whole lot about it, and it's difficult to diagnose. Data gathering methods was my fifth, and that gave you a lot of information about forensic anthropology and the different, say, methods that are required in order to gather the information that's needed. When you're looking at a case that is completely skeletonized, you have to go about it a completely different way than if you're going to go about doing a forensic pathologist case where the body is not completely skeletonized. You're going to have to deal with some very different things. There's internal examination key points, which I also researched, which was just basically giving me an overview of what I should look for when the individual is opened in a forensic pathologist's case. And there was the UNT trip, in which I got to visit lots of classes, which correlated almost directly with my topic of study. It was really interesting to go. I got to go specifically to a microbiology class, and I didn't get it to sit in for too long, but it was really interesting. I was sitting in, ironically, on their day that they were going over some very specific body functions, and I got to see a really in-depth examination of those body functions, which I thought was absolutely amazing. So my original product was a booklet, and basically what happened in my booklet was I wrote down, made notes about the most unnatural deaths that I could find. That includes cold cases, suicides, homicides, accidents, and I liked to offer solutions. Although I didn't include the solutions in my actual final draft, I went through and was able to look at a lot of the cases and kind of mentally make solutions and maybe hint at them a little bit. I didn't want it to become a Sherlock Holmes book. I just kind of wanted to make it more of an informational book. I analyzed the possibilities of all of the different ways that this person could have died in certain circumstances, or what the solution might have been to that. And I was able to analyze serial killers specifically, which was really interesting. I really enjoyed looking at serial killers because there were a few that I had never seen before, and that's almost rare for me. I enjoy reading about them. And so when I went and put them into categories, I made sure that it was very easy to find what needed to be found. And I think that made all the difference, because it's easier to find information that you want when it's in a very organized place. So I'm going to read one of each case from each section. So for my homicide section, I chose the West Mesa bone collector, which I think was one of the most interesting. In 2009, in West Mesa, Albuquerque, New Mexico, there's a bone collector. They never quite found his identity. However, he was a serial killer. He would focus on prostitutes, and he had a large dumping ground, so he would kill a lot of prostitutes and dump their bones there, and there would just be multiple individuals there. After he ran his course, they had a new safety protocol for all of the prostitutes because they were so frightened about getting murdered by the West Mesa bone collector. And a lot of these people here are some of his victims. In particular, this girl, these three, I don't think that they were killed. If I remember correctly, they were victims, however, they were not murdered. The rest of them, I'm pretty sure, were killed. Suicide, Delta Losing Hand. I thought that was a really clever title. It was not mine originally. In 1930, William Coggett was on death row for murder. However, he decided that he didn't like being hanged. It was not a cool enough way to die. So he took the steel bed leg of his bed, obviously, playing cards, he ground them up and put them into the hollow part of the bed leg. He took a broom handle and sealed off the end, and he put water in through the broom handle, and then he put it near a kerosene heater, and the heater was able to trigger the explosives in the playing cards, which each playing card back then was made with materials that were explosive when exposed to certain amounts of heat. And so he was able to activate those playing cards and actually killed himself using this method. It caused an explosion and almost acted like a gunshot to the head. And so he was able to take his own life before they were able to put him on death row by using this technique. This was an accident. I thought it was extremely interesting. Kurt Gödel, he was a genius mathematician. He won the Einstein Award. He was very intelligent. He worked through problems and solved issues. In 1978, however, he suffered from extreme paranoia to the point where the only person who could make his food was his wife. Otherwise, he would believe that he was being poisoned. He would not eat in any other way. However, his wife became very ill, and she had to go to the hospital, and she was unable to prepare his food. And so he died of self-starvation because he would not eat any of the food given to him by anyone else except for his wife, and she was unable to prepare for him. And so when he actually died, his weight was 68 pounds. So my final product, which I think is probably the most interesting part of this maybe, writing a death certificate. So everyone knows that there are death certificates, but if you get a really close look at a death certificate, it has a lot of information on it that's very specific. It tells you, a lot of times they have diagrams where you can circle, like say where someone has been shot or things like that. You fill out their weight, their organ weight, their limb weight, etc. If it's skeletonized, you put lots of information on there. So when I began my product with my mentor, she brings us this box into the room, and she sets it on the table and she says, here's your case. And it has a case number on the side. I had to take an inventory of the bones that were inside. I pulled out 4 bags. There were lots of loose bones inside. But specifically, I took an inventory, and this is what I found inside the bag. However, these here, the spinal cord, was located in one paper bag. Where else? The ribs, no. The patella was located in a separate bag. And there are 2 foot bones, if you will, that were located in separate bags because they're small. And there was also an animal mandible that was found and marked to be a possible fetus, which was incorrect. But it's also very common for that to happen. A lot of the times in cases, you'll receive bags where the police or whoever's investigating at the time will make speculations on what they think the bones are. So they'll write like neck bones or hand bones, and you have to kind of run over it a little bit more and see if they're correct about that. So I needed to be able to determine the race of the individual, the gender, the stature, and the age, just from looking at the bones. That was my goal and my job, basically, with this case. And so I determined that I was going to be telling the race from the skull, the gender from the pelvis and the skull, the stature from the long bones, and the age from the pubic symphysis and the ribs. And there's, of course, the animal presence, which needed to be looked into as well. You need to determine what animal that is to put in your report. So in order to determine the race, I had to look at the nasal foramen, which is right there. And generally, the nasal foramen differs greatly between the races. For a African American individual, the foramen is usually a lot wider than it is lengthwise, and for a Caucasian individual, it's usually much taller and much skinnier than it is in any other race. And for the Asians, it's usually rounder. And so that was very important to look at. That was one of the most determining factors for me, I think, in the race. Then I had to look at the nasal prognathism, which is basically where the bone cuts off here in the nose and the cartilage connects, and you have to line it up with the teeth in the front. And in a Caucasian individual, the nasal prognathism is not very extensive. Usually it's very linear. The nasal prognathism is very straight. You can line up the nose and the chin very easily, whereas in other races you usually have more prognathism in the teeth. They poke out a little bit more, and so it kind of slants upwards or downwards. The eye orbits, as you can see here, are very angular and almost square. The suture presence, there's a suture presence right here, if you can see it. It's not actually common in a lot of races. The only common race that has the suture presence is the Caucasians. There's a nasal root contour, which it's about here. You can see it comes in and it's steepled, which just basically means that it comes in and comes back out again. It's very thin and narrow, and that differs greatly from race. And there's, so that you can see the nasal prognathism, which is right there. For the gender, the skull texture is one big determining factor of gender. For males, there's a lot of muscle detachment that is very present in the male skull, and so usually male bones will be very rough and just jagged, and that's where the muscle attaches, whereas females by nature are usually, they have smoother skulls and more petite skulls, smaller frames. However, that's not always the case. In women that like to bodybuild, say, there's going to be more muscle attachment, and so you're going to have to kind of look at more features to determine their gender than just the skull. However, I think that in this case it was generally, it was pretty determinable. The eye orbits are usually pretty delicate and sharp as opposed to a male. The male have very defined, rough features. There's an occipital protrusion in the back that has a name that I didn't put on here because I didn't know it at the time. However, there is an occipital protrusion that comes out about there in males where one very large muscle attaches, and it's almost always present. However, that's again not always the case. There's the anterior acetabulum of the pelvis, which basically the pelvis is very different in size than the male pelvis, and so the anterior acetabulum is where the femur head connects, and usually it points more anteriorly in a female. And there's the pelvic inlet, which is where the childbirth happens, and generally that's a lot wider in females because of childbirth. And so when you're looking here, when you put these two together, the width of the pelvic inlet was definitely enough to be a female. That's the sacrum there. Usually it's actually straighter in females and more curved in males. So the stature, the long bones, that's the general means to determine the stature. You use a method called the Trotter method, and you take the bones and you measure the maximum height, which you have to take by putting it in a special bone measuring machine, which is just basically a block with a ruler, and you move it around until you get it to where you can get a maximum height, whichever way makes it stand taller, and then you multiply it by a set number for that specific bone, and you'll get the estimation, and the estimation is generally in centimeters, and you have to make it into feet if you really need it into feet, or you can make it into inches. So the age of an individual is determined by the Succi-Brooks method, and it can be used on the pubic symphysis, which is what you see here, which is the front of where the pelvis lines up. And what happens is there's a lot of deterioration that happens in the pubic symphysis as life goes on. And so you will see, in a young individual, you'll see lots of what's called rippling. I guess you could call it rippling. It's almost like you see ripples in the surface, or billowing is the word that is actually used. And when it starts deteriorating, a lot of that billowing gets rubbed down with friction as bones clash against each other, and so there's lots of deterioration. And so this individual, as you can see, doesn't have much billowing, and there's a very defined rim that started coming around as the inside is sinking in from all of the friction. And so this individual actually has a stage 3 of the Succi-Brooks pubic symphysis I don't know. But basically what I'm trying to say is that in stage 3 of the Succi-Brooks, you get a estimate on how old the individual was, and I think the estimate was probably around mid-20s, early 50s. They give a generally a broad range so that it doesn't exclude any people if the individual is just in a little bit better shape, but they're older. You can also tell from the rib determination. There's a sternal end which connects to your sternum here, and that also undergoes a lot of deterioration as time passes. And so when you look at the individual sternum and the rib where it connects, you see a lot of basically the same stuff that happens in the pubic symphysis. You get a rim, it starts becoming deeper, and that can help you determine what the age is of the individual. And we did the rib determination as well, and it came out to be about the same as the pubic symphysis. So that's a close-up of the sternal connection of the rib. This is a mid-thoracic, so it's like somewhere in the middle. And then the conclusion that we came to was that the sex of the individual was a female because of her smooth bone structure and her pelvis determination. She was about 21 to 53 years of age. We determined that from the pubic symphysis and the rib. Her stature, 5'1" to 5'2". Generally, her long bones gave her a pretty solid determination. And her ancestry was Caucasoid, which is what they actually call it. I'm not sure why. The official documentation. So this is the very final step of my final presentation, or the final product at hand, I based it off the actual reports that she gave me. She gave me her reports to kind of look at and see what was going on and how to kind of replicate it. So I had to write a forensic report. It didn't quite look like this. This is definitely not from the area. This looks more like the practice sheets I had to do, that they give you a sheet and you go through and mark all the stuff that the body has. It's used to determine the cause of death, which is pretty common in almost all states. I'm pretty sure use it. They identify an individual if possible. Sometimes it's not possible and the individual remains unidentified. It can also be used historically, such as in bones, when they determine World War II individuals. You have decedent information, external examination, skeletal inventory, findings, conclusion, manner of death, assessments of age, sex, ancestry. Basically, anything that you come into contact with, you have to tell. Did this person have multiple animal bones? What were they? What did they belong to? Why would the animal bones be there? You can give a speculation of what you think. What's the age? What's the gender? What's the stature? You have to give your estimation of what you think it is, how you think that is.